Good survival horror is relatively rare when compared to other types of games. Graphics are not as important, but gameplay and controls are paramount for a good experience. Perhaps that's why I struggled to include more than 15 games in this list. I played almost 30 survival horror titles this last week, so it's not for a lack of trying. I should add that the Manhunt games had minor graphical issues in hardware mode. You can play in software mode, but at native resolution it looks like a blurry mess. With that out of the way, let's get started. This may come as a surprise to some, but Constantine was a great movie licensed game. The character of Constantine is actually based on the Hellblazer series of comics, and several actors reprised their roles for the video game, including Gavin Rossdale and Tilda Swinton. The strength of Constantine is the story, which sometimes overlaps with the movie, but also does its own thing.
Huh?
She mentioned that she would not be coming back for some time.
What?
She was wrong. She won't be coming back at all. So it's just you. You are all alone in this world now, little girl.
Clock Tower 3 is the first in the series to allow direct control over the player character, whereas the previous games used point-and-click mechanics. Personally, I felt that Clock Tower was graphically impressive, while also being well-directed. However, there were times when I was left floundering because I didn't know what to do. And while you occasionally have a weapon to defend yourself, you'll be running and hiding for the most part. Shattered Memories is a reimagining of the first Silent Hill game, but set in a different universe. The story and characters are somewhat different, and you cannot fight back against monsters. It's an interesting take on the original, but I could never get into it, despite admiring the sound and lighting effects. I'm sure someone else might like it despite my negative sentiments though, so if you're looking for something different, this isn't a bad game.
I have to head back. You're on your own, people. You heard the man. Keep it tight.
Cold Fear was released only a few months after Resident Evil 4, and it was one of the first games to use the third-person view in a similar way. Having said that, it wasn't quite as good outside of combat, still relying on tank controls and static cameras. There's also the matter of enemy monsters, who wouldn't die unless you shot them in their heads. This wasn't so bad on the PC version because mouse aim was precise, but this was extremely hard with a PS2 controller.
I'm really scared. Please do something.
I landed in some woods about 100 yards from the manor. Can you see me?
See you? How could I? Help me, for Christ's sake. Turn on your flashlight.
Alone in the Dark, the new Nightmare was made for 5th-gen hardware, before being ported over to the PS2 sometime later. You get to play as one of two characters, each with their own stories to follow throughout the game. If you don't mind the tank controls and muddy graphics, the new Nightmare is a great game. The only thing that annoyed me was the slight delay every time the camera changed. If you prefer a smoother experience, I would actually recommend trying this on PC.
Some Professor Brooke murders 10 students and then scoots.
Wow. Was there an arrest?
No, he vanished. No weapon ever found. No
Ghosthunter falls into the underrated category because it does everything really well. It has great graphics, great voice acting, slick handling, and a competent story. The game throws a few curveballs at the player, most notably showing a false ending before the credits roll. Restarting actually continues the story. During development of the US version, over 1,000 improvements were made over the European PAL version, which had been released over 6 months earlier.
Hey, you a doctor?
Can I help you?
That fire last night. The girl who was burned. Is she here?
For a long time, Silent Hill Origins had an issue on PCSX2, where only half of the flashlight would shine in poorly lit areas. It was fixed a year ago, so now you can finally play Origins as intended on the emulator. As for the game itself, it was ported from the original PSP version and was enhanced with better textures and lighting. It was criticized for lacking bonus material, a mini-map and manual camera control, but overall it's a really good game.
I wonder if anyone's here.
Fatal Frame 2 follows twin sisters Mio and Mayu Amakura as they explore an abandoned village and experience encounters with the paranormal. Their lives quickly become threatened when the village spirits begin to possess Mayu and target them as sacrifices for an ancient ritual. Fatal Frame 2 has been singled out as the scariest in the entire series and has almost no relation to the first game. For those of you who are interested, there is an enhanced Xbox port, but it's not yet playable on Zemu.
I didn't know there was a garden behind this iron door.
Upon release, Obscure was met with mostly mixed reviews. Over the years, however, the game has garnered a cult following, thanks to appreciation of its story and unique gameplay. What I found interesting is that progression is unaffected by a team member's death, outside of a few key moments. The player controls 5 teenagers as they explore the school and battle a number of different types of monsters. The students discover that the enemies are sensitive to light, with direct sunlight being able to destroy them. I'm not saying Obscure is the best game ever, but it definitely deserves your time.
What the hell?
Team Silent had 2 development teams working on Silent Hill games. The first was responsible for Silent Hill 1 and 3, while the other team was responsible for Silent Hill 2 and 4. That might explain why there was so little relevance across the different games in the series. Nevertheless, Silent Hill 4, The Room was the last game developed by the Japanese studio, given that Konami wanted Western developers to take over. In a way you can understand why, Team Silent was running out of ideas. Regardless, this was still a great game. Code Veronica was supposed to be the true sequel to Resident Evil 2, following Claire Redfield's story after the events in Raccoon City. But sometime during development, it was decided that the game would be a spin-off title instead. I thought it would get a remake, just like the other games in the series, but Capcom seemingly forgot about its existence. Incidentally, Code Veronica was initially a Dreamcast exclusive, but there were always plans for eventual PS2 and GameCube ports. The PS2 version included new cutscenes, which helped to elaborate on the story.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a last-minute entry, and now I'm playing this game.
Blackmore owns Eastern now.
The Suffering, Ties That Bind continues the story of Torque, a man sentenced to death for murdering his ex-wife and 2 children. In the original game, after arriving on death row in Abbott State Penitentiary on Carnate Island, an earthquake rocks the facility, and the prison is attacked by strange supernatural creatures. During the mayhem, Torque escapes. Ties That Bind continues his story as he flees the island and heads back to his hometown of Baltimore. In my opinion, this is still the best survival horror game made by a Western developer. Admittedly, Resident Evil 4 was graphically superior on GameCube, but it was still a technical marvel on PS2. Firstly, it was never supposed to run on the console, but Capcom managed to port it over by deprecating the lighting and shadows. Also, in-game cutscenes were replaced with pre-rendered cinematics. It had a few advantages over the GameCube version though, like having a true widescreen option and a new scenario for Ada Wong. Most people have played RE4, so I'm not going to bother singing its praises, but if you somehow missed this, what are you waiting for? Silent Hill 2 is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, and probably has one of the biggest plot twists in gaming history. There's plenty of hidden symbolism throughout the story, which only becomes apparent once the player reaches the ending. While the animations and combat haven't aged that well, the overall atmosphere makes this an unforgettable experience. I know some of you will be surprised that it's not number one on my list, but there's one game that barely pips it to the top.
Where am I?
Silent Hill 3 is technically more impressive than Silent Hill 2. While it doesn't delve too deeply into symbolism and psychology, it does conclude the story arc from the original game, which was released on the PS1. Silent Hill 3 offers better controls, camera angles, and graphics. Nevertheless, it does borrow heavily from its predecessor as well, so the gameplay can be somewhat derivative. It's easier to get into though, so while it's not as revolutionary as Silent Hill 2, I just like it more.